on Ministry Monday. I'm talking to Dr. Benjamin Cornelius-Bates, but today, for the sake of this conversation, I'm just going to say my friend, Ben. Hey, Ben, how are you?
I'm good. How are you, Amanda?
I'm really well. I'm really well. If you are just tuning into this episode, Ben and I have been now talking for 45 minutes before we actually started recording this episode because Ben and I have known each other for almost 15 years. We went to school together. And so I wanted to talk with Ben today because I wanted to talk with you about just practical skills and tips that pastoral musicians can use throughout the Advent season. But before we get into that, I'd love it if the listeners could hear a little bit about you. So would you mind sharing a little bit about yourself?
Sure, of course. I have, by trade, I guess on paper, I am a composer and an organist and improviser. When Amanda and I were in school together, I came to Duquesne University specifically to study improvisation. I heard the wonderful organist Olivier Latry improvise, and I said, I want to learn to do that. So I came and I studied that, and I've made that a big part of my life, and enough that I got to compete a couple times in Europe. Never won anything, but that's not the point. As a composer, I have primarily worked with choral music, not usually congregational liturgical music, but primarily music just for choirs, and a lot of organ music, although I've written a few other things as well. And my terminal degree, my DMA, is in composition. And so I like to think of trifecta of things as organist, composer, improviser.
That'd be quite the triangle. And so now you teach at Duquesne University.
Yes, I am a full-time faculty member at Duquesne, and I don't teach organ. I teach music theory currently, which is the classes that scare all the kids.
Except me, although I will say that. I was always the person that loved music theory. I almost majored in music theory for my master's. Did I ever tell you that?
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah. Yeah, I love music theory. But now you are the professor that doesn't scare people away from it. You make them and help them foster a love for it.
That's right. Well, and actually, it's a important two days discussion. If you don't feel like, the only way I can be an improviser is if I have a good, strong mastery of music theory, you don't. It does help. It certainly does help. And I would encourage anybody to, at least in part, study it. But improvisation can be in and of itself a study of harmony. And I truly believe that everyone has something to bring to the table. No matter what your background is, no matter what your skill level is, you have something to bring to the table. And otherwise you wouldn't be playing music.
That's a good point. And actually, let's stay right there. Let's start from kind of like the basic foundational idea of improvisation. So do you have any foundational building blocks, if you will, for improvisation? Maybe someone's listening and they really haven't tried it, or they just don't feel like they could. Would you mind kind of starting there?
Yeah, that's for those of you who are listening to this and not watching it, I'm going to describe what I'm holding up. First thing you need to do is get a notebook. I have my notebook here. It is about half full. I have 2 more of these filled up with all kinds of notes that I make for myself. Now, this is a dirty secret of improvisation. No improvisation is truly improvised, where everything is made up on the spot, because we are the sum of all the things before us. And having a notebook is really handy because it helps us keep notes and keep track of things. So that's a very practical step 1. The second step is to just try it. You have to do it. You don't know how, you won't know how to dive unless you dive off a diving board. You won't know how to improvise unless you sit down and just try making stuff up. Which, on that point, let me start with, to me, what perhaps is the greatest place to start with improvisation, which is to play music you like. I think that, for many of us, improvisation can be overwhelming because we might think, oh, it's jazz, or in the organ world, I mentioned Olivier Latry, who's one of the organists at the Paris Conservatory and Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. My God, he's one of the best organists in the world. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is just simply sitting down and exploring your instrument. Just saying, I like the way these notes sound. I like the way these groups of notes fit in my hands. And then the test of all tests that I tell folks, if it sounds good, it is good. If it sounds bad, well, it's not bad. It just means maybe we need to make a different choice and adjust that and learn from that choice. So the next time it comes around, you make a different choice. So that's part one.
Yeah, part one. Do you think, can you just talk really quickly the difference between improvisation and composition?
Yeah, that's a really great question because those are two different things. They can be related, and in our modern age with, and I'm going to use some computer instruments, a lot of film scores and a lot of TV shows are improvised, sort of somewhere between composition and improvisation. But I like to think of them as the primary difference between them is improvisation. You can only play as good as you can play on the spot. And by that, I mean, like if you're an amateur pianist, you will only be able to improvise as well at the level you are at. Whereas composition, you can write a piece that is outside of your core skills. So let's say you can play a major scale up and down at quarter note at 100 and eighth notes or something, compared to somebody who could, fly up and down the keyboard at 16th notes at a quarter note at 140 BPM. That those two skill levels are going to be different. So therefore your improvisation is going to be different. Whereas composition, you have time to work up to the level of the music itself.
That makes a lot of sense. It does. So you don't have to be someone who is actively composing to really improvise and spend time on that craft.
No, absolutely not.
Mm-hmm.
And improv, I think the other, I don't remember if this is Oxford or where I saw this definition, but I remember one definition of improvisation was spontaneous composition. It definitely, the spontaneous part, and that's where it gets tied into technique. And I do like that spontaneous part, although we'll talk how much of it actually is spontaneous. We'll get to that a little bit, but there is that aspect. There is that aspect of in being in the moment.
So let's start there. I know we're going to kind of dive into maybe some specifics for those who are listening, and we have specific scenarios we'd like to talk through, but let's talk about that. Let's say, okay, how do you prepare to improvise?
So the best question of all questions.
Oh, good. And you didn't even tell me to say it.
I didn't. Improvisation is all about planning. I guess we can call this my tip number one. Improvisations are planned. How much of it you decide to plan can be up to you, but most, in my experience, and I think most organists, jazz musicians, lots of people that have come across, plan out what they're going to do. I went to, I heard Pierre Pansmay before he passed away. I heard him play in concert, and he did a little master class in organ improvisation. And the thing that's astounded me the most was he actually talked about, setting up all your pistons on the organ, you have to set up all your colors and plan out all that stuff before you even begin. And I thought, oh, that's it. Here we think improvisation is so much spontaneous, yet there he was planning all these things out. Or let's say in like a jazz tune, like there's a certain amount of time in which you will spend improvising compared to a certain amount of time in which you play the chart. So there's always a format or a framework in which your improvisation is going to work in. And so I'll get more into some details about planning in a little bit. bit. But that's when it comes back to having a notebook where you can write these things down and say, okay, well, this is what I'm going to do here. This is what I might do here, and kind of sketch out an idea of where you're going to go.
Okay, so you've mentioned now, of course, setting up a framework for improvisation, which is a really good point, and I think I want to talk about that a little bit more later too. But you mentioned something before that, to be honest, Ben, I've actually never heard before, and that is making choices that are good or bad, or maybe just not the right, like making a different choice. Can you talk about that again? Just kind of making those choices.
Yeah, let me flesh that out a little bit more. When I say there's kind of a spectrum in choice, there's always, that's why I say like bad decisions not quite the right word, and maybe neither is good. You could say there's better decisions and maybe not better decisions.
Okay.
Try not to say worse decisions, because one of the other tip number 2 that I think every improviser in pretty much every genre of which this happens is, if you make a mistake, repeat it. It's a
Yes.
really, really, really important thing, because if you hear something repeated, it doesn't sound like a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
But I also want to say that if you do something you really like, repeat it.
Yeah.
Because if you like it, you should do it again. If you find a combination of chords that sound really pretty, use that same combination again. Those are good things. Just why I say this idea of it being not good and bad, but maybe a spectrum of perhaps better choices and worse choices. And it comes back to something else I said, which is trust your judgment, trust your ear. If you're a musician, a liturgical musician, you know what good music sounds like. I mentioned the idea of, imitating sounds you love, that then combine that component with repetition, and you can start to discover the secrets of how a certain person writes a piece of music or things that they like. And when you repeat them, when you're trying to imitate somebody, that's when you really start to that group of techniques, then is when you can really start to begin to bud as an improviser. That's what I'm trying to say. There it is.
Good. Yeah. I love, love, love the idea about repeating the mistake. I once heard a concert that I think it was like something that NPR put on or something, but I once heard I heard Bon Iver, if you're listening and you know who Bon Iver is. I once heard Bon Iver do a concert and he hit a wrong note. And then you could tell he paused and then he just hit it again. And it was like, I knew it was wrong, but because he like kind of worked it in, you really didn't notice. And I love that, because I think we so panic as pastoral musicians. Like the minute we hit a wrong note, it's like, oh, but really, if you work it in, it's not a mistake.
I think the other another saying I should throw in there is that you're always a step away from a right note. You're always a step away from a right note, so that wrong note can then just sound like not an accident, but a dissonant companion to the correct note.
Oh, dissonant companion. Love that. Oh man. Okay. All right. So we've talked a little bit more about theoreticals. Can we get a little bit into some hypotheticals? Kind of maybe putting a little bit more flesh in it.
Sure. Let's start with I think maybe the easiest place to start, which is post-communion. I think all of us as liturgical musicians have dealt with communions that go on for a while. Or I like an offertory where the priest decides to incense the altar, and they take their time. And so we finished our offertory hymn and we need to fill in time. And that is that can be a challenge. So let me start. For those of you watching this, I'm going to share a screen. For those listening, I will describe what I'm doing, because I have a couple of hymns here and I have my fake organ ready to go.
Oh, it's kind of nice.
And up here I have perhaps the most well-known of Advent tunes, which is O Come, Emmanuel. And I want to start with one of the simplest and oldest ideas in all of music, and that is the simple idea of imitating a line. And this can be as complicated as row, row, row your boat, or Johann Sebastian Bach's St. Anne's Fugue, which is a 5-voice triple fugue. It's a great piece of music, but it is a tough piece of music compared to Row, Row Your Boat. They're both operating on this simple idea of imitation. And I mentioned that, like, that skill level, what's amazing to me about imitation is it's so, the breadth of how complex it can be and how simple it can be is just, it's huge. Taizé does lots of really wonderful rounds and that sort of thing. That's real. They're fun to sing, they're fun to accompany, and yet they're so simple. And I just mentioned the Bach a second ago, or they can be horribly complicated, like his organ fugues or the well-tempered clavier fugues.
Right.
So I want to start with the simple idea of imitation, and it can be either the organ or the piano. I'll pull out my fake piano in a second. But take O Come, Emmanuel, and one simple idea is like having the left hand and the right hand be imitations of one another. And you can take, the way I like doing this in the beginning is simply taking one hand, playing maybe a handful of notes, and then the left hand imitates it. And while the left hand's doing it, the right hand is simply holding a note down. So that's it. And then all of a sudden, I think that sort of imitation is, you hear the line, you hear it again, and it's both complicated and yet simple. And you can continue that on for a while. Like all things, I will say, do things in good taste. If you do that sort of imitation for that entire hymn, it would get really boring within 20 seconds. So, and that's when you want to add variety to things. So maybe you imitate for a little bit, and then maybe add a short interlude in between a couple of those stanzas, a couple of the phrases of the verse. So maybe a couple of pretty chords. And now they've finished incensing.
Yeah.
We're done. And that I wasn't timing all of that, but that was probably 30 to 40 seconds of music. And that was simply with a little bit of imitation, I was able to get a lot out of one line of music. And it's not too hard to do. It might take a little practice, but that simple idea of just playing a note, holding it down while the left hand then does the same thing. You could do it vice versa. If you're at an organ, you can also mix it up with different stop sounds. If you're working with a folk group, I used to do this at the St. Paul Monastery where I used to work with the folk group. I'd have one of the guitarists take one of the lines, and then I would do the imitation. And if you have a folk band or a violinist or something like that, you can still use the same framework in the same way, and just prep your musicians a little bit, and all of a sudden, and actually I will say that's really fun, because then you get in like this conversation thing with your instrumentalists. And I think it's a really simple but really effective way to take one line of music and draw it out a bit.
Cool. I love that idea.
Let's say if you're planning these things out, I say you have your notebook and you plan this out. That's one plan. You say, okay, well, in the case of, let's say, communion, some of us have had to play communions where they go on for 10, 15 minutes. The choir has sung a choral piece, you've sung, or the congregational sung a piece of music with a really good, strong chorus, so everyone can sing along with that. The choir sings, some sort of a cappella piece, and only half the congregation has gone through. So now you have to fill in 7 more minutes. So first, let me speak to one piece, which is really, this is the easiest kind of music to make. And I think this is particularly effective for the season of Advent, which is to use silence. We often don't talk about music that isn't there. Rests are notes too. They're just notes we don't play. That you can use space in things to really affect. I mean, if we're thinking nuts and bolts about time, we need to fill in a lot of time. Well, then use some of it in silence. Let me kind of demonstrate this a little bit. So let's take that O come Emmanuel again. Keep going. But you can kind of see that effect of like a little bit of space there really leaves it almost like a question mark. But I think that's really fitting for Advent. I think that's a really powerful way to, I don't want to distract, I'm not trying to distract people, but draw them into the mystery and the anticipation that is the Advent season. So and honestly, it's the easiest thing to do as a musician is to just not play. I'm going to say, I don't know how much this came through in the, I don't know how much is going to come through in the recording, but I definitely took a breath before I started playing. And that can, if you do use silence, I would highly recommend using breath as a big part of it. That can help you figure out how long that silence should be. There's definitely too long. There's definitely too short. If you're in a very reverberant space, you might want to, have more time. If you're in a very dry space, you might want less. But I would use your breathing to really let that be drawn out. Another really nice technique is to let a melody slowly unfold. And I'm going to switch which tune I'm using. I'm going to go over to Carrie Landry's Waiting in Silence. This is out of the Breaking Bread hymnals. And I like this tune because I think you can let it unfold very slowly. And by that I mean is like only introduce a couple of notes at a time. Now I'm also going to combine this with one other really nice idea, which is to have a simple drone. And by drone I mean like or an ostinato rhythm or a pedal tone. All of those things are pretty similar in the sense that they are kind of doing the same thing. An ostinato, which would be a repeated rhythm pattern or harmony pattern that repeats over and over. A drone would be something like, if you're at an organ, you could have your pedals hit down on a couple of notes, or a pedal tone, which is like the same thing. So I'm going to do this at a piano this time. And I'm going to use this tune. And what I mean by unfold the melody slowly is like introduce several notes at a time. And so we have finished communion. People have just sung this, but I'm going to use just a couple notes at a time to let the melody, 3 notes, then maybe 7 notes, then maybe the whole phrase. And I'm going to keep a simple pedal tone just because I think that's a really nice, effective way. And again, that was 20 seconds or so. And all I did was, again, one phrase, one drone. Now, if I kept going, of course, that was 20 seconds. I would say, maybe by the second or third phrase, you really should incorporate some kind of change. But that's an effective way to fill up. You can fill up a lot of time with just those couple of things. which I need to point out another tip here, which is don't worry about your time and don't worry about your meter. If this piece is in 3/4, and what I did was kind of in 3/4, maybe sometimes 4/4. I don't know. I wasn't really counting. That's not important. In improvisation, I don't think keeping a strict time is as important as ideas and feeling in the moment. This one, I think, is perhaps a very hard thing to do. And I'm going to go to Curtis Stevens' Ready the Way, again from Breaking Bread. And this is, again, one of the I think one of the big hurdles that improvising can be challenging is getting away from root position chords. Now, I just did a pedal tone, and those are really, really nice and effective. But one really great way to, again, create instability, and for those of us who study music theory, inverted chords are inherently unstable because they don't have root position. You don't have the root and the bass, and you don't have that perfect fifth element inside that chord. That's why diminished chords and augmented chords are also unstable, because they don't have to have that perfect fifth. But a first inversion chord, so that's the third of a chord being the bass note, is inherently an unstable chord because there's no perfect relationship between the chords. So let me play, I'm going to play everything, and there's a term for this. We'll get to that in a second, but I'm going to play the melody of Ready the Way, and then I'm going to stick a first inversion chord under every single one of those notes. That would be something like this. Now, combine this with a drone, and you get a very cool sound. I made a mistake. I'm gonna repeat it. Repeated it twice. There's two terms for it. It's either faux bourdon or it's called planing, as in the French Impressionism style of Debussy. But that, and again, I made a mistake. I repeated it twice. Probably didn't notice, and they're just with a pedal tone. I took the melody, not really in time. I kind of am, and it creates a really lovely atmosphere. You can also use second inversion chords, but you can take whole melodies and just stick them all in first inversion, and you just get this wonderfully sweet sound that, again, is kind of like, again, fitting for what I think is fitting for Advent, which is like, I want to hear a root position chord. I want to get to the end, and which is, again, it's kind of like what Advent does for us. And I'm sure most congregations aren't going to be sitting and go, I see what they're doing. But they're going to feel it. They're going to feel it.
Right.